33 years of professional experience in forestry and natural resources education, management, and research. He focuses most of his energy on building partnerships to improve woodland management and on family forests. Dave coordinates A Day in the Woods, a woodland owner outreach effort focused on Ohio's Appalachian woodland owners. He currently is serving as an outreach coordinator for the Ohio Interagency Forestry's Team Collaborative Oak Management Initiative. He's been a member of National 4-H Forestry Invitational Committee since 2006. Other programs that he has helped develop since joining OSU Extension include Call Before You Cut, Ohio Society of American Foresters Directory, and Ohio Woodland Stewards Program. We are so excited to have Dave with us today, and we know we're going to learn quite a few tips and tricks to identify those really hard trees in the winter. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Dave. But one more quick announcement, folks. If you have questions, Dave has requested to take them live. So please put them in the chat. I will send you a quick message to show you where the chat is. Please go ahead and put those in the chat as needed and as questions for Dave come up. Without further ado, we'll hand it over to you, Dave. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Holly. And thanks everybody for getting up this morning. And it's actually nice out there. So when we get a chance to get done, maybe you can go out and practice some of the skills we pick up from today's program. So Jesse, can you hear me okay? Everything sound good on your end? Give me a thumbs up. So today we're going to talk a little bit about winter tree identification. And am I sharing my screen? I still am sharing my screen. You're seeing the PowerPoint, correct, Jesse?
Correct.
Okay. I was going to share the web, but we'll do that at the end. So I want to go through a PowerPoint, introduce some of the concepts of winter tree ID, give some examples, and then we'll visit a web page where there's a bunch of resources for you for winter and all season tree ID. So again, if we have questions, don't hesitate to throw something in the chat and I'll be glad to do my best to answer it. So we do a lot of programs. I've done a lot of programs over the years through winter tree ident or through Ohio Woodland Stewards. We've developed some keys. We've done quite a bit over the years. And when we do a summer tree ID program, we usually start out with, or we end up with this slide. So we talk about leaves mostly in the summer, and leaves are where most people are comfortable. It's a good place to start. But as you know, in Ohio, there's a season, quite a bit of the season where we can't get the leaves. And as you learn those winter ID characteristics like buds and twigs and bark, they can be handy any time of the year. So once we get into winter, some other things you want to start looking at are bark, which we'll focus a bit on, but we're mainly today going to focus on twig characteristics. So we're going to look at buds, leaf scars, the pith, which is the center of the twig. Occasionally you'll have fruit left over in the winter or evidence of it on the ground or somewhere, sometimes still hanging on the tree. In the winter, rarely do we have flowers that are popping, although we're into the spring, in the late winter and starting into spring. So there are some flowers that are starting to pop right now. So I would like to make this interactive because when I'm talking at the screen and see myself and no one else, I don't even know if the connection's still working. So at this point, can anybody think of any flowers that you might be able to find out there now in the landscape or in natural settings? So if you got any ideas, pop that in the chat. And yeah, Holly, if you'll leave yours on, that would probably help me. That way I at least know we're still connected.
Absolutely. I usually turn it off for the best video, but I will leave it on if that's your preference.
Karen says witch hazel and snowdrops.
Snowdrops, I can see that. Anything else that you can think of?
Hazelnut.
Hazelnut. There you go. That's one we actually talked about before everybody got on. And I've actually got a little video. If the video quality will work, we'll show a little video because most people see the stamens or the male flowers of hazelnut, but right now there's some really cool little red flowers that are popping that are female flowers. Vernal witch hazel, the native witch hazel is the common one, is pretty much done and been done for a while, but there's some other witch hazels that are still popping. So those are the main ones. There is one other one that the new video we just did this week, the willows are starting to pop. So if you have salix, hackberries flowering too, good. Maples are close, probably red maples. If they're not, they will be soon. And somebody caught me before I was able to say that. They popped that in the chat. That's good. But the willows, the pussy willow, Salix discolor, and there's some in the landscape. I'm sure at Dolls you probably have some willows that are putting on quite a show right now as well. So yeah, keep your eyes out. Things are going to change rapidly as we warm up in this month of March. Thorns are another thing that we'll look at. And we use the term thorns a lot, but I'll actually describe the differences between the types of pointed, sharp things that can cause you to have some pain. And that'll help you with ID if you know the different types of thorn type structures. The shape and the form of the tree, just how does it look, especially if it's open grown or even in the woods. You can tell a lot of times trees will have either a central leader or they'll have different ways that they branch, and whether they hang on to lower branches. All those things are good. And then the location and the site is also important. In nature, it's not that trees will only grow in certain locations necessarily, but for instance, species that grow in a swamp only compete well in the swamp, and species that grow up on dry ridges don't compete well elsewhere. So it's good to know where you are on the landscape. And that is largely driven by moisture conditions and soil conditions. So bark, just some examples. Some are obvious. Folks know what this one is. Shagbark. Shagbark what? Hickory, great. Any other hickories have bark like this? There's one that you got to be careful. It's a close relative of shagbark, but you'll find it in low-lying areas, typically floodplains. It's called shellbark hickory. And it tends to be a much larger tree with everything on it's larger. The buds are larger. It has more leaflets. The nuts, they also call that one king nut. So the nuts are probably the best ones for human consumption because they're large. But they both have very thick husk and they have very similar bark. Oops, here's some other examples of some bark, this real blocky bark. And I know it's tough with what's really hard with PowerPoint because you don't know scale. But these are two real blocky bark trees and very similar in appearance. Little subtle differences when you look closely at the two. Any guesses on what those two might be? Persimmon, left or right? Reuter, left or right? Which one's persimmon? Yep, that's persimmon. A little deeper furrows. I don't know how to describe it. And bark, you can't find good keys because there aren't really good words to describe it unless you're probably an artist or somebody more visual than I am. But deeper furrows for sure. And these tend to have these little scaly things on the surface. Any guesses on the one on the right? Very common tree in Ohio, but always gets overlooked. And it's very common, especially in southeastern Ohio. It's not a pine. We'll see more of this one later because when in doubt, my dendro students, when I taught at Hawken College, would guess this one. And a lot of times they were right. It's black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. And its bark can vary a lot depending on how old it is and what site conditions it's growing in. Another one, bark looks very similar when you can't tell scale, but these plates are much smaller. This one's flowering dogwood. And you can always tell a dogwood by its bark, right? So that's one way to remember dogwood. It's going to have these small scales. They're probably less than a ½ inch, quarter to ½ inch little plates or little blocks. And then lots of other examples in the winter months. Some stick out like this black cherry. And after it's wet in the woods, it's usually the darkest wood or bark out there. It just looks really dark. Others are on the totally opposite extreme. Bark is a really hard one to describe, and the best way I can tell you to learn bark is learn as many characteristics as you can. When you identify a tree, always just look at the bark and associate it with the tree. And if you do that with every tree you identify and pay attention to the bark as well, it'll eventually just stick in your brain. That's probably the best way I can tell you to do that. Bark is really strange. The biology is different on every tree, but essentially bark, and this is oversimplified, but essentially bark is old phloem. Phloem is what carry the food reserves up and down in the tree, and hormones and other things, but it's outside of the cambium layer where the growth occurs. So if you think about it, if the tree is growing at that cambium layer and the phloem is on the outside of it, as the tree grows, it outgrows its clothing or its coverings. I always like to use the analogy of the Hulk, Incredible Hulk. Outgrows the coverings on it, and then it splits and has to do different things. Some will peel those outer layers and not keep many layers. Others will hang onto those layers, and the highest part of the ridges on the bark are the oldest phloem. So that's why you get different patterns, different growth rates affect how bark looks. That's one you probably don't see much. It's rare to see one this big anymore. This one is actually butternut, or white walnut is another name for it. And there's a canker disease, a fungal disease that is causing major problems with this one. So it's not nearly as common as it once was. And then this is probably my favorite bark and really illustrates those layers of phloem. And then if you look on the very highest ridges on these bark layers, that's the oldest covering that was on the tree from years ago. And you can almost count the number of years how old that bark is from the base to out to here, at least what's visible. That's one of our pines. This is actually pitch pine, and it's one of the few that actually has buds on the bark and can actually sprout. So that's a good clue on that one. As far as fruit, there's not a lot available right now to look at. This is actually beech, and the beech nuts actually have kind of a husk on them, similar to hickory, but they're kind of spiny. Those could still be on the tree, or they could be on the ground. The nuts inside are probably gone. They're triangular, and the squirrels like them. Sycamores will hang on to their fruit almost all winter long, but here in the spring, as soon as we get real low humidity days, those things will start falling apart, and you'll get the seeds getting dispersed by the wind. I had a person at one of my classes kind of said it reminded him of the paratroopers at Normandy coming in, because they're just everywhere. So I'll give you a hint. I learned this the hard way. Don't paint your deck when those things are flying and you got sycamores all around you, because it creates a mess. Other things like the, what are these things? Who can help me out?
Man, I don't know. That's a hard one.
I know, especially where I work, it's hard to figure that one out.
That's a really hard one.
At least give me yeah, it's a buckeye. There are actually two native buckeyes that are fairly common in Ohio. There's Ohio buckeye and yellow buckeye. Yellow buckeye, in this picture, I wish I'd have flipped one of those over, because the husk on the yellow buckeye is very smooth. They can be very large, and the fruits tend to be quite a bit larger as well. Where Ohio buckeye is going to be kind of bumpy and warty this time of year, and as it develops, it's real spiny or spiky. So the Ohio buckeye looks similar to the horse chestnuts that you'll see in the landscape occasionally as well. But Ohio buckeye is found throughout most of the state, usually on floodplains and down along streams. And you'll see that down here in southern Ohio on the broader floodplains like the Hocking River. But yellow buckeye is pretty much in Appalachian Ohio. It's in the unglaciated hill country, and it can actually be a very large tree on side slopes. It's a really neat tree. But the fruit is a good key ID characteristic to separate those two. What do we have here? Any guesses? And remind me, Jesse or Holly, what's our time frame? Because I got to we keep stopping a lot. We may not get through a lot of it, so I want to try to time it out. What are you thinking? An hour total?
We have
a
the
little
Zoom
longer
until noon, so
okay, we're good. Okay, yeah. We probably won't go that long, but
yeah,
I'm not a big believer in 2-hour Zoom calls. I think it's
they're rough sometimes.
beyond the limit here. That's redbud. And there are several species of trees that are in the bean family that have fruit that are similar to this. But what's interesting is where these fruits occur. The flowers on redbud can be on twigs, large twigs, on bigger twigs, or even on the main trunk of a redbud. So the location of the fruit and the flower is another key thing. And And that it won't be that long before you'll start seeing the buds. But if you look now, you'll probably see the buds. They just haven't expanded yet with Eastern red bud. And then there's lots of other fruits. These are winged fruits. These are cones of yellow poplar or tulip tree. These are actually silver maple seeds. We'll talk more about these as we go. And then, of course, you've got walnuts. These are butternuts, which are a type of walnut, which are more elongate. Other fruits are pretty much
question
gone.
in the chat
Yes.
from Dawn. It says, I grew up in New Jersey and we used to see something that looked like Buckeyes all the time, but we called those chestnuts. Is that different?
I don't know whether it would be chestnut. There's probably not much Native American chestnut over there, but there could be hybrid chestnuts, and the fruits look fairly similar. They're not going to be as shiny or glossy. They tend to be a more dull, maybe even like almost a fuzzy appearance on them, but they'll have a patch that looks kind of like a walnut, or I'm sorry, like a Buckeye. So it very well could be some kind of chestnut, especially if it's in a landscape or a non-native tree, an old home site or something. It very well could be. Chances are you're not finding much American chestnut that's producing fruit because of the chestnut blight.
And then another quick question, Karen, if you scratch a stick on an Ohio Buckeye, I've heard it has an odor. Is that true?
So we'll get to twigs in a bit, but yes, odor is one good tree ID characteristic for some species. The big caution, the disclaimer is at least eliminate the few things that could be poisonous that can cause a problem before you go scratching the twigs. But Ohio Buckeye, and I used to say this more when I went to Purdue, but I don't say it much now because it get me in trouble because I'm employed by Ohio State University. But when I went to Purdue, we always said that Ohio Buckeyes were worthless nuts that stink. So there is some truth to that. If you scratch the twig, another name for Ohio Buckeye is fetid Buckeye. And it does have a skunk-like odor. You just scratch the surface of the twig, expose that green layer underneath, and it does have a skunky odor. And you can actually separate Ohio from yellow Buckeye with that odor. So that is true. What about this fruit? For scale, those things are probably a little bigger than a BB, maybe 1/8 of an inch or a little bit bigger in diameter. They're in little clusters. They almost look like clusters of grapes, but they're more whitish. The fruit you really need to get to know. It's out there everywhere. I hunt a bit, and when I'm sitting in the tree stands in the winter, there are songbirds eating these fruits all winter long. But it's one you need to recognize. Couple other clues are the buds are kind of light tan and naked, so they don't have any scales covering them up. But this is one I like to throw out so people know what it looks like when they're out and about. And I want you to know this species, no matter what time of year it is. Any clues on that one? Any thoughts? Nothing in the chat yet, so we'll give that one away. It's poison ivy, so be aware of poison ivy. And I've got some right out my window here. I can't tell if there's much fruit hanging on or not, but there's probably still some of that hanging on. And then there's just some wonderful native fruits. This is the native Eastern burning bush or wahoo. Just phenomenal, beautiful flowers. We got 3 predominant sumacs. There's actually a 4th native sumac, but the three of them have these vertical clusters of seeds that are probably just about gone by now, but they still could be hanging on, depending on whether the deer could reach them or not, because they tend to eat them late winter. But this one's more vertical, stays bright red. This is smooth sumac. The staghorn sumac looks pretty similar, but the twigs and the fruit are much more hairy. And then this one has fruits that droop down more and are darker. This one is called shining or winged sumac. So there are still some fruits that you might see hanging on. You've also got, these are all ash seeds, and just the differences between white, green, and black ash. Again, not one we don't see as much anymore producing fruit because of the emerald ash spores. So I've made at least 3 references to species of trees that we don't have around much anymore because of non-native, either diseases or insects. So kind of sad. We're very blessed to have the diversity that we've got here in Southeast Ohio and the rest of Ohio and species of trees. So it is devastating to lose one, but I can't imagine it being an ecosystem that wasn't as diverse and how bad that would be. The oaks, I could spend days talking about oaks. So I just want you to be aware that all the oaks, the best way to identify them is probably by the acorns, probably the most consistent way to do it. So you're looking at the size of the acorn, you're looking at the cap, the texture of it, whether it's hairy or bumpy, warty like this. You're looking at how much of the cap is covered, or how much the acorn is covered by the cap. In this case, bur oak covers more than half. This is white oak down here. You're looking at whether they have a stalk or not. It's called a peduncle, new word for today. It's probably not in many people's vocabulary, but the length of that stalk, the white oaks tend to have a stalk instead of being attached right to the twig. But this swamp white oak has a very long one, usually at least 2 inches in length. Great ID characteristic. If you see acorns on a big long stem like that, almost guaranteed it's swamp white oak. So lots of good ID characteristics out there. Even though the acorns are probably gone, usually the caps don't get consumed. And so you can usually find them on the ground, and that's a good ID characteristic. I see Betsy had a question about the age to produce acorns. So in Ohio, we probably have well over 20 species of oak, and they're all different. Bur oak's a pretty quick acorn producer. Others may take longer, but a lot of that depends on the site conditions and how fast they're growing. But most don't produce acorns till they're at least 10 or 15 years of age. In a forested setting, they're probably not going to produce many acorns until they're up in the canopy, but in an open grown yard, they can produce quite a bit quicker. Bur oak is probably the quickest. There's a non-native one. I don't ever recommend the non-native ones in the landscape, or rarely do, but the sawtooth oak produces within a few years too. Swamp white oak's actually fairly quick too. Somebody put that in. Usually that stalk will stay on the cap, to answer the question. So the acorn will get consumed. If the squirrels or deer don't get it, mice or something will eat it, but usually the cap's there and the stalk stays attached. Just an example of the backside of the swamp white oak and where it gets its name. Leaves of some species stay on the ground year round. Oaks do not decompose fast, and you can go out there and find the oak leaves all over the place right now. Maple and things like yellow poplar start to decompose and break down really quickly. So it's hard to find intact maple leaves this time of year. But some species leaves hang around longer. And in fact, some species, the leaves hang on to the trees even into the winter. And some will have them until spring. I'm seeing a little bit out here of some shingle oak in my yard that's still got just a few leaves hanging on. Beech is another one that'll hang on to leaves for a long time.
Another
but the reasons
question, do any of the other oak acorns keep that little stem?
the white oak group tends to have them, but they're not nearly as long. So most species in the white oak group will have a little stalk. But what the key for swamp white, if it's much over an inch, it's probably swamp white. And they'll all keep them if they have them. And we could talk acorns all day. The ones I showed up till now were all in the white oak group. Those acorns usually fall fairly early in the fall. When they hit the ground, the radicle, the root starts coming out that very fall. The red oak group, which we got northern red, black, and scarlet here shown, they will not germinate till spring. So they have to go through a cold, moist period in the winter before they'll germinate. So that one of the things that distinguishes white oak from red oak. The other thing is white oak acorns, you'll have pollination of a flower in the spring and the acorn matures that very fall. So one growing season, you have an acorn. With the red oak group, it takes 2 full years. You have pollination, the acorn starts to form, it overwinters on the tree, it matures the next year, hits the ground and doesn't germinate till the next spring. So it's literally 2 full years where white oak produces a mature acorn that sprouts in that one growing season. So that's kind of a neat difference between those two species as well. This is a group of hickories. Again, can't get in a lot of depth, but the hickory is one of the best things. One, hickories you can separate from walnuts because they have husks that split. They have natural sutures or splits that you're going to see, and you'll see these hickory nuts, the husk will come off in segments. And then the other key with hickories is the thickness is a great identifier, helps you narrow it down. If it's very thick like this, 1/2 inch or more, it's probably shagbark or shellbark. If it's a little bit thinner, maybe 1/4 to 1/2, it's going to be mockernut hickory. And then the two thin ones are pignut and bitternut hickories. The bitternut tends to have these ridges that you'll see, and they don't necessarily always split completely. So you can separate your hickories pretty easily, at least narrow it down a lot by the thickness of the husk. Those husks hang around for years, and they usually don't fall far from the tree. So you can look under hickory trees and pick those up. And that's a good way to start separating your hickories. Cones and needles, we won't talk much about conifers, but with pine cones, the big deal, and the conifer cones, the pines, as whether they have these little spiky tips on them, whether they're armed or not, is a great way, and how sharp these prickles are, whether they are persistent and they're year round or whether they're shorter. Happens to be Virginia pine. The other thing with the pines, they're all multi-needled, the ones in Ohio. So you're going to find them in these groupings. So how many needles are in a grouping? How long are the needles? Are great ways to get your pine separated. And then how do we separate pine from most of the other conifers? What's the big way we separate them? Somebody pop that in the chat. So a lot of people call most evergreen things with needles pines, but they're not all pines. So what is the distinguishing thing between pines and many of the other conifers? And conifer just means cone-bearing tree. So it comes down to the needles, or with pines, are usually in bundles or bunches. And usually it's 2, 3, or 5. With most of the other conifers, they're single needles attached right to the twig. So yeah, somebody stuck in there, Brian put in needle grouping. So if they're single needles, then it could be a fir or a spruce or one of the other conifers. And then again, needle length. Cones on pines are usually pendulate. Cones on firs are upright. So there's lots of little clues that'll help you narrow things down. Throwing a bunch of stuff at you. So, and then some cones don't look like cones at all. These are technically cones on this tree. It's a tree that's very common in southwestern Ohio. Any clues what this one is? They look more like berries, technically, or a lot of people call them berries, but there's actually like more of a cone-like structure within. And then the next question is, what do we make from those berries? So somebody put red cedar. So it's eastern red cedar, and technically it's a juniper. And anybody know what these cones or berries are used for? Give everybody a little chance. Gin, yeah. So if you want to start making your own gin, you're going to have to move to southwestern Ohio or down into Kentucky, where there's a lot more eastern red cedar. And there are a few hardwood tree species. Things related to birch and alder oftentimes has a cone-like looking structure. We've got some native birch, and the alders will have a cone-like looking structure, but they're usually much smaller. As far as flowers, we've already discussed this one. The witch hazel is one of the very few you're going to find in the late fall or early winter. And then we discussed a couple others, but form and shape are a great one. This is classic shape of an elm. They tend to branch very low. It looks like all the branches are stuck in a vase. Looks like a flower arrangement. And you can see from this picture, if you imagine another one right next to it on the opposite side of the street, how you'd have a nice arch over your boulevards and streets in urban areas. So that's one of the reasons they were preferred street trees, because you didn't have low branches that would interfere with traffic and trucks and pruning. You had just a nice tunnel. Again, another species where a non-native disease, Dutch elm disease, has pretty much wiped these out, at least mature ones. We see young ones in the woods all the time. Just some other things as far as form and shape and texture. Typically large leafed trees have big gnarly branches. And if you think about it, it's common sense. If a tree has a very small leaf, the twig or the branch that takes to support it is very small and fine. Things like catalpa have very large leaves. It's going to take a very large branch to support it. And so when you look at it in the winter, they almost look dead because the twigs are so large. And then this one's got some fruit hanging on too. The little cigar shaped fruits are still hanging on. And then location and site. There's kind of the extreme. I like to use this example though. Bald cypress grows in the south. It follows the Mississippi River and the Ohio River up to almost Louisville, Kentucky. So it's a native, but it doesn't quite make it to Ohio. It's a native of the eastern United States. And in nature, that's where you're going to see it, in a swamp. But it does perfectly well in a yard. You probably got them at the Arboretum. They do quite well. It's not that they won't grow on drier sites. It's that they won't compete well elsewhere. And the reason for that is because they need to get started in a swamp, they leaf out very late. And the leaves don't pop out until much later than almost all of our native hardwoods. When you think about growing in a woods in that setting, they're in the shade when the leaves pop out from all the other competitors. So they don't compete well. But when they're in the open and got plenty of sunlight, they'll do well on a variety of conditions. So we'll jump into twigs briefly. This is from Lucy Braun. I'm going to grab the book here. Lucy Braun is, and it's going to be too glossy to see. I can almost see it at that angle. Lucy Braun is one of my favorite books. It's a little technical, but it's the Woody Plants of Ohio. And what I like about it, it's got great line drawings, and it's got maps of Ohio, little thumbnail maps of Ohio with the counties. And if it's known to occur there, then it's got a dot on the map. So it helps you, hey, is this even going to be found in the woods where I live in Ohio? And that's one of the great things about it. The line drawings in here are phenomenal. They're some of the best line drawings in any book. So if you're looking for a good reference book, I use this one all the time. It's Lucy Braun's The Woody Plants of Ohio. And if you want to learn a little bit about some history of biology and botany in Ohio, she was a giant. University of Cincinnati. She's, I think, the first, either her or her sister was one of the first females to get a PhD at the University of Cincinnati. And she is renowned for her skills in botany work in Ohio and all of Appalachia. So it's a neat reference for you. But back to twigs, some things you need to pay attention to with twigs are the buds. Usually the bud on the tip is called a terminal bud. And it's often different than the buds that you'll see on the side that are called lateral buds. This is actually a buckeye over here, and this is a tree of heaven over here in comparison. A couple other things you want to point out is this thing here. It's called a leaf scar. The shape and the size of that leaf scar is going to help you identify trees in the winter. Essentially, what this leaf scar is the mirror image of the base of the leaf where it attached. So if you pull a leaf off of a tree and look at the base of that leaf, the twig is gonna be like a mirror image. So the size, shape of that, and these little dots are called bundle scars that carry water resources. That's where the xylem connects. How many of those and how they're arranged are also great ID characteristics. I think that's probably enough from this twig. One thing might be of interest to you. A lot of times you'll have this thing called a terminal bud scale scar. It's kind of this thing that encircles the twig, and that's where the previous year's growth started. So if you can imagine that this bud here set here last year, and then as it grew, those bud scales peeled back, and then it grew this much. So you can actually age twigs by counting the distance between these. So you can get an idea of age of twigs and branches that way as well. And little dots or bumps are called lineacles, and they're kind of like stomates. They allow for gas exchange, just like stomates on the leaves allow for oxygen and CO2 to be exchanged. So we start same place as we do with summer ID, is whether they're, and this is probably one of the things that when I taught dendrology really recommend always ask yourself, is it opposite, alternate, or world? And that's how the leaves are arranged. Are they paired? There'd be a leaf here and there. That's opposite. Are they alternate? Do they alternate sides of the twig? Or are they world? And you can't get that in a 3D image, but you would have a leaf here, here, and there in the back. So there'll be 3 leaves and 3 buds at a point on the twig we call a node. Let me go back one. I guess my back arrow is not going to work, so I won't bother with that. But a node is a point where the leaves are attached. And if there's a single leaf at that point, it's called alternate. If there's 2 at that point, it's called opposite. And if there's 3, it's called world. Good way to remember that. Remember mad buck? These are the main ones, not all of them. But of the trees, this works pretty well. Maples, ash, dogwoods, and buckeyes are all opposite. Leaves are going to be always paired. Buds are going to be paired. Where you have one, you're going to have one on the opposite side. If you think about these 4 groups of trees, genera here, the leaves are totally different between a buckeye, a dogwood, an ash, and a maple. So it's pretty easy once you get to that point to narrow it down even further. So in winter and summer, this is a great thing to pay attention to. Because right now, these buds may be swollen, but these are paired. And they're opposite. This is sugar maple, this is red maple. So there's major differences in twig color and bud shape, more rounded versus pointed. Red and silver are difficult to tell apart for most even foresters and biologists if you just look at the twigs. And then the pointed ones are usually sugar, but black maple have sharp pointed buds like this too. They tend to be more black or dark in color. Ash paired up again. Again, bigger compound leaves. Twigs are usually stouter, but again, leaves are paired. And the buds are going to be paired. This is actually blue ash. You can see there would have been a leaf over here and a leaf over there. Notice on the blue ash, the twigs are square. So that's kind of cool. And then another one that's very unusual, you'll find it in swamp areas, called black ash. This one, paired again. We've talked about a lot of the opposite ones. Anybody know this one based on the twig and the bud there? And for my younger audiences, it's been pointed out to me, it looks like somebody's flipping the bird with this one. So whatever you need to use to remember, just something that you can stick in your brain that helps you remember it, you probably won't forget that because of that. That's actually flowering dogwood, and that you got that single bud, and then the leaves were attached up here closely. The terminal bud's pretty obvious, but the smaller buds on the side are not. So that's flowering dogwood. Twigs tend to be a little bit reddish near the tip, and they tend to curve up. The undersides stay green and the tops are more reddish. And then they can also have a big flower bud, which we'll talk about later. And then our buckeyes, Ohio and yellow. Ohio has a distinct keel. If you think about the ridge on the bottom of a boat, it's called a keel. And with Ohio buckeye, you'll see that nice ridge on the buds where you won't see that on yellow. They're more rounded, and they're not going to have that keel in those buds. And again, the buds have lots of scales that cover them up. So they're covered up with multiple scales. Just some difference of types of terminal buds. Some have a true terminal bud that looks different than the side buds. Others can have a cluster of buds. If you see a cluster of more than 3 buds, typically it's going to be an oak. Looks like a knuckle sandwich with buds. And then other buds, you'll have a twig, and the terminal bud looks very similar to the side buds or the lateral buds. This is called a false terminal. And what happens is these trees will grow all year till the growing conditions are no longer favorable, usually because of dryness. It gets too dry. They'll stop growing, and then they'll die back to the last lateral bud. So you're seeing a bud that looks just like the side buds. Other species, we call that determinate growth. They'll grow so much, and the length varies depending on the moisture availability, but so many buds will pop, and then they'll set new buds. And that's the oaks. And then this is yellow poplar, which is one of my favorite buds. Looks like a duckbill. You actually have 2 bud scales covering up the vegetative growth below them. And if you're ever bored, you're out there in the field and you can find some of these, start peeling those back, open those buds up, and you're going to see the buds, the leaves from the growing season coming up, folded up inside there. They're tiny. You'll see them folded. They're folded in half and tend to fold down. But all packed within this bud is all the growth for next year. You can actually count how many leaves are in there and how many buds there will be that growing season in those buds. So that's kind of a cool little thing to show kids, actually. And I don't know how that spider appeared there when I took that picture. I didn't know it was there until after I developed it. These are all oaks, just to show you that they're all clusters of buds. Some are more rounded, some are more pointed. Typically the red oak group is more pointed. The white oak group is more rounded. And then there's a few that are odd, like bur oak has these little claw-like structures around the buds called stipules. So you can identify oaks by twigs in the winter. Some are pretty tedious to separate out, and we have some hybridization, but in general, you can tell your species of oak just by the twigs in the winter. Real critical if you're planting tree seedlings and you get a big order in, you ought to at least be able to check and make sure it's the right thing. So that's good to be able to know and have that skill set. Talk a little bit about lateral buds. Those are the side buds. Some lateral buds and twigs are very zigzag. The twigs zigzag, and then right at the bend is where you're going to find the lateral bud. Pawpaw on the left. Did I jump too far? Which slide was that from Cecilia? Was it?
That was the yellow poplar.
Okay, that was poplar back there. Yep. Bud length is another good one. Probably one of the longer buds you're going to see out there. With if you exclude a couple that occur here in Jackson County, we've got. I was telling Jesse that and Holly that we have big leaf magnolia and umbrella magnolia. They have very long, big buds. But of the more common species out there, American beech has this long cigar-shaped bud, can be up to about an inch long. This is actually serviceberry, which that's something you ought to start be looking for soon. It should be flowering any week now. It's probably just a little early. White flowers you're going to start seeing, but they're pretty long buds, not as long as beech. And then some buds are almost not apparent. They're actually sunken below the surface. So we've got American beech. We've got drawing a blank, serviceberry. This is just black cherry, fairly short bud. And then this is sourwood, which is a common one on some of our drier, exposed acidic soils here in the southern part of the state. Oh, there they are. Fuzzy bud that can be very long is big leaf magnolia. If you're looking for an outing, Lake Catherine State Nature Preserve and some of the surrounding private land is the only place in Ohio you're going to find big leaf magnolia. Occurs from here all the way to the Panhandle in Florida. There's another species that is very similar, but leaves are 3 feet or more in length. They look like banana trees growing out in the woods, so they're really neat to see. And they have flowers that are about like a dinner plate, just huge, beautiful white, creamy white flowers. They occur in usually about late May to early June. And then the flower buds. This big swollen bud looks like almost pumpkin-like is the flowering dogwood bud that's preformed and ready to pop in the spring. And then who had the question about pawpaw? This is the pawpaw over here. So the buds on the tip are essentially the leaves folded in two. There's no coverings or scales. But these big swollen buds on the side are the flower buds. So they're totally different looking buds, whether they're flower buds, more rounded, swollen ones. This is just a vegetative bud that will produce a leaf. But the big swollen rounded ones are going to be the actual flower buds. And they're all kind of fuzzy, velvety, hairy. They actually say artists used to use these terminal buds as paintbrushes. I don't know how well they'd hold up. I'd probably break it off right away, but kind of cool. These flower buds are actually always in pairs, almost always. It's called spice bush. It's a shrub you're going to find out there commonly. That they flower pretty early too. I don't think we're ready for them yet either, but they'll be coming. They come out before the leaves do, as do the pawpaws. The pawpaw flowers will be popping fairly soon before the leaves do. Lots of stuff. I hope I'm not overwhelming folks, so stick with me if you got questions, be sure to ask. These are all hickories, and they vary a lot. This one over here is actually a shell bark. Look how it's hanging on to these old outer scales. They hang on all winter. Shag bark and shell bark do that. This one is mocker nut. Those scales are gone. So these are kind of newer, greener scales. Pig nut and mocker nut do that. And then this one really doesn't have scales. It's called bitternut hickory. So the hickories can be easily separated into groups based on their buds throughout the winter months. Other things, pay attention to bud scales. Two species that in the woods are very hard to tell apart if they don't, even if they have leaves, basswood and mulberry, the native mulberry, red mulberry. But this one has lots of scales. This one only has a couple. So that's an easy way to separate those two in the field. 2 bud scales versus 5 or more usually on mulberries. Leaf scars where the leaf was attached. That's how we separate our ash, whether it's U-shaped or rounded. The hickories and the walnuts all have a really cool look to them. They almost look like little monkey faces. One of my favorite ways, and a lot of people can remember that. The shape, and then these dots are the bundle scars, vascular bundle scars. You can see the eyes and the nose. So how those are arranged are also good characteristics. And a lot of keys will refer to those. This is sycamore, American sycamore. The leaf scar completely goes around the bud. Really unique. In the summer, when the leaves are on, you don't see any buds because they're covered by the base of the petiole. The stalk on the leaf actually completely covers the bud. And then the winter, when the leaf's gone, you'll see a scar that completely encircles it. Bundle scars, how they're arranged. If they're this is sweet gum and black gum, but they have 3 dots, very consistently 3 dots. Not the only thing that does, but just a way to confirm it. To me, this always looks like Brutus Buckeye here's face, even with his goofy little hat sometimes. But 3 dots is real common with sweet gum here and black gum over here. And then one of the last things we'll jump into is thorns. Not all spiny, sharp things that poke and make you bleed are thorns. Technically, thorns don't have any buds on them. And they can be singular, like most of the hawthorns are singular, but they can branch depending on the species. They can be like, for instance, honey locust branched, or if they are sharp and pointed but have little buds on them, they're probably technically should be called spur shoots. And what spur shoots are, real common on a lot of our fruit producing trees. Those are short little stout branches that are not only sharp, but a lot of times they'll produce the fruit. So they're usually on the 2-year-old wood, and those short little structures where the fruit is born are called spur shoots. This is the branched honey locust. And then with black locust, these thorn-like structures are called spines, and they're right at the base of the leaf. They're actually modified leaf type structures, but you'll have a bud with spines on both sides. So if they're paired up, they're probably those stipular spines. So the kind of thorns they are, their length and whether they branch or not is a good way to separate species too. And then there's a few species that got spines everywhere on them. The honey locust can, especially in nature, it varies a lot. There are those in the landscape that don't have any because they're selected for that. And then this one is not a real common one, but you'll see it in parts of Ohio. I see it a lot in the Hocking Hills area. It's called Devil's Walking Stick, and it'll have spines from top to bottom, real sharp pointed spines. Pith is just the center of the twig. Walnuts, if you cut into the walnut, it's going to have these big open chambers. So it's called chambered. There's several species. This is actually tulip poplar or yellow poplar, has these things called, it's diaphragmed. It's usually like spongy, like a styrofoam center. And you'll have these lines breaking it up. Those are the diaphragms. And then others are solid. Don't use that a lot. But if you're not sure, sometimes that's a way to confirm. Take a small twig and cut into it, and you can see that. Some are hollow. This is Paulownia, a non-native tree that's becoming pretty invasive in the southern part of the state. It's got a hollow center. And even in a big cross section of a tree this big, you're going to have a hollow center. And it's very obviously hollow from top to bottom. And then other things on twigs to look for is color. Very few things stay green year round. This is sassafras. Box elder, which is opposite, is green year round, but the very new twigs and several years worth of twigs stay green on sassafras. How about this one? Anybody seen bark or twigs like that with that real strange quirky bark? I know what that one is. I wish I knew what caused it because it's not consistent on this species. Sweet gum. Sweet gum does that. There's also a winged elm that's you'll find south of here that does that. But sweet gum, I don't know if it's moisture conditions or what, but get these strange quirky ridges on the bark, which I think are attractive in the winter when the leaves are gone. Another example of texture of twigs, all three sumacs. Smooth sumac is got like a waxy coat. I can't tell from the names on the thing how old people are, but people in my generation remember waxing a car. You put the wax on, it gets this haze, and then you remove the wax and it shines. Or an apple, if you rub it on your shirt, it shines. Well, that waxy coat is on the twig of smooth sumac. And if you rub your thumb on it, it'll shine. So it's got a waxy coat. The one on this end has got these little hairs. That's staghorn sumac. It looks just like a deer antler is where it gets its name. And then this one doesn't have either. It just has these little bumpy lineacles all over. And it's a much smaller twig is the shining or wing sumac. So again, three sumacs and the twigs are totally different. So if you learn that, you can find them in the field and identify them any time of year. The hazelnut we mentioned earlier has little short hairs all over the twigs year round. Another great ID characteristic. You'll see it on the twigs. You'll see it on the little leaf petiole, the little stalk on the leaf. Catkins are preformed flowers. These are pendulant. So you'll find that on hazelnut like this and on birches, which hazelnut is in that family. And you'll also find it on alders. This is the non-native black alder. They use it a lot in mine reclamation. You'll see it in parts of Ohio. And then the thing a lot of people don't think about is the rachis. So what is a rachis? On a compound leaf, it's the structure where the leaflets are attached. They usually don't decompose. The leaflets will fall off, but the rachis is on the ground. Unless it's an area they mow every year regularly, you can usually find the rachis. And you can pick it up, and if you feel it, you can kind of see these bumps along this rachis, this ash rachis. You rub your fingers along it, you can actually, wherever there's bumps, there's two leaflets, and then usually one at the tip. You can actually count leaflet numbers by picking that thing up off the ground. If it's a walnut, they tend to be longer. If it's a tree of heaven, they tend to be longer. So you can tell a lot about what the leaves were like by picking those rachis. And I don't know the plural for rachis, rachi, I don't know for sure. But if you pick up the rachis, that will help you. Any questions at this point? We're just about an hour in, and then the rest of it, I thought I would just kind of take you on a tour on some resources that might be helpful for you to identify. So I don't know, Jesse and Holly, do we want to take a little break? 5-minute break, give people a chance to stretch after listening to me for an hour, or what's the best? And probably only got about 15 minutes to wrap up here. So it's really up to you guys.
We just go ahead and keep going.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm keeping my video off because my internet keeps coming in and out and is a little
Totally
unstable.
understandable.
So I think we just keep going. I think that I know I've learned a lot. So I'm excited to hear more about your resources. And I know it brings me great solace that this is going to be recorded so we can continue to watch it as, you know, things pop in our brains a couple days later and go, I remember him talking about that.
I will give you context stuff. So And I'll share a web page later, and you can always email me pictures. And if I can help you identify stuff, if I can't figure it out, I usually got a little network that we challenge each other with, sharing pictures around. So we'll share all that with you too. If folks need to take a break, the cool thing about Zoom, I don't know if you're there or not. So if you got to run, get coffee or whatever, go for it.
We had one question pop in. Any tips on IDing a shoe-marred oak versus red oak?
Probably acorns are the best. I don't see enough shoe-marred off the top of my head. Hang on one second. I'm going to keep talking, but I'm going to try to grab a resource. And I got the wrong one. Actually, the book that is shown there, and I can never get the angle right. The book that's shown there is a great resource for you. And probably acorns are going to be your best. There'll be some subtle leaf differences. I think shoe-mards are the leaf sinuses, or the cuts in the leaves are a bit deeper than northern red, but leaves are tough because they're so variable. But and I'm guessing there are also some bud characteristics, but like I said, it's been so long since I've thought about shoe-marred oak. We don't have it down here as much, so I'm not familiar with it. But this key, it's called Fruit and Twig Key, and it's by Harlow. It was produced just a couple of years ago, in the 50s, actually. And it was one that we had, actually 41 was the first edition of this book. But what's cool about it, the front is a fruit key. So when you get in the front of this thing, and I don't know if I can get that angle right, try that way. They're actually diagrams of acorns side by side, actually black and white photos side by side, comparing the different acorns. And I was going to look at shoe-marred and see if I could find it quickly. Probably won't take the time to key it right now, but you can actually see good pictures, black and white pictures of all the acorns side by side for comparison. And then the back is a twig key. So comparisons of twigs, black and white photos, the buds, and what to look for. And there's actually a little key that walks you through how to separate them. So I like it. The keying's really not too bad. It starts with opposite alternate and works your way through. If you know it's an oak, you can go right the oak section and look and compare. This is a wonderful resource. You can still find them online for about $8 or $9. And it's the one that's on the PowerPoint. So it's Harlow's Fruit and Twig Key. Highly recommend it. Just a great resource for you. And you can grab that information if you want. I don't know. I don't think I can grab it. I was going to see if there's any way to grab it, but I don't think I can. But I highly recommend that one. And I apologize. I just don't know the easy answers. I don't think the acorns are quite the same. Northern red is classic, very broad barrel-shaped acorn with a very shallow cap. I'm thinking shoe-marred cap's a little longer. That covers more of the acorn, but can't tell you any more than that at this point. But that's a question. If you want to email me, and I'll give you my contact, you're welcome, Betsy, to email me that question and I'll look it up for you. Another great resource it's a newer one, great photos. University of Kentucky has a winter woody plant book. So that's a great one to look at too. I see a comment. Yeah, I see it. Is blue ash resistant or summit resistant emerald ash borer? Of the ash, I think is one of the more resistant. Doesn't mean emerald ash borer can't kill them or won't kill them. It just will take longer, but they seem to be able to fight it off a little bit more. And in areas where we have some blue ash, they seem to hang around a lot longer. And there are some that are still alive. Now, how long that will be and whether they can continue to live or whether eventually the EAB will catch up, I can't answer that question. But they do seem to have some more resistance than especially white ash and green ash. Probably the best thing I would recommend is this website, Dendro, and just the best thing I can tell you if you don't get this written down, and we could type that one in the chat pretty quick. CNRE.bt.edu. That website is really good, but better yet is they have a phone app and it's interactive and it will have keys built in. It knows where you are. So it's actually can use your location to narrow the list. And with both of these, as you work through the key, it'll start out with opposite alternate. It'll have a winter and a summer key. And it's got a list of hundreds of trees from North America. Your phone app will narrow that list based on where you're located. And the online app will ask you where you're located, and it'll narrow the list. And then it'll start asking you more questions. And as you go through the key, the list gets shorter. It might not get you to the one tree, but there'll be a list below it of the trees that are still in the running when you get to the key. And then you can click on each of those and see images of what they look like. Leaves, buds, bark, fruit, all of that is on there. Wonderful interactive. It's free download for if you got a smartphone, and really good. The online version I like because if you're a woodland owner or there's a park you like to frequent, you can actually make your list of species there and print a one-page sheet that's got nice color photos of all the characteristics and very short descriptions of leaves, buds, bark, fruit. And you can create your own tree ID key, actually put them in a 3-ring binder with one of those plastic protective sheets, and you can make your tree ID book for Dahl's Arboretum or whatever. Dahl's would be tough because I'm sure a lot of the non-native stuff that's at Dahl's wouldn't be in it, but a lot of native stuff's in it, most of the native stuff. So it's a really cool resource. I highly recommend it. And probably,
David, what did you
yes.
say the app is called?
It's V-Tree.
V-Tree.
Right,
okay.
Right there.
Awesome.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Really, really cool reference. And a lot of people say, why hasn't Ohio State done that? I'm like, well, why would we reinvent the wheel? We can't come close to what Virginia Tech's done with that, with the resources we've got. So there's the VTech or V-Tree.
Awesome. Yeah, wonderful.
And you notice on this one, it says Blacksburg, but it depending on your settings, you can tell it where you are, or you can enter a location. And that's a little dangerous because the locations, trees can be moved and transplanted, but it's just a great resource. And then there's a fact sheet that you can pop up with the other characteristics, like what kind of site conditions. It's got a range map too. So it's really great. With that, that's all the paper resources in that resource, but I do want to share this website with you. And if you're just interested, I'm going to type it in. If you're just interested in the tree ID side of it, if you do this one, it will get you to the tree ID section of our webpage. And if you go here, there'll be a tab. So let me take you there. Let's see what happens. Am I still screen sharing? Are you seeing the web? Great. So first of all, we do the Day in the Woods that Holly mentioned when she introduced me. So if you're interested in events and opportunities to learn, we posted our tentative schedule for this year. And coming up next Friday, we're doing a program on native grasslands and pollinator habitat. Got wonderful speakers from the Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. We've got folks from OSU and from Local Soil and Waters helping with that. That's all going to be virtual by Zoom. We've got one on technology. We've got understory plants. We've got one on the interaction between woods and water, and we're actually going to end that with a float trip on Raccoon Creek. And just on and on of what we've got in the fall. In the summer, we're going to do a tree ID class. So we got lots of opportunities all on that webpage. I highly recommend you checking it out. The link for the pollinator site's the top post, and there's a hot link on how to register for that online Zoom class. That's free. The live events are usually $12 and include a lunch, so you can't beat that. At the top of the page, we've got a menu, and there are several videos that are out there. there's a whole series on chainsaw safety. There's a series on, it's just the other recordings, all the stuff we've accumulated over the years through Day in the Woods. There's recordings on how to make a tree measuring stick and how to use it. There's all kinds of stuff there. There's also one on woodland boundaries. If you're a woodland owner, why you want to maintain those boundaries, know where they are, and highlight the evidence on those. But if you click on tree ID, or you go to go.osu.edu/tree ID, it takes you to this page. And what you'll see is a featured video. I try to post this. These will get posted on Facebook, usually on Tuesdays. I don't do it every Tuesday, but we've done most of them through COVID. And so there's a highlighted clip that you can click on and just play. And that's the newest one. And then there's a list alphabetically by common name of all the videos that we've got on Tree ID. And I believe there's right at 80. So they tend to be 3 to 5 minutes long. And I just do an overview of what you use to identify them. So I try to hit everything from leaves to buds to fruit. You know, sometimes that's a challenge because it depends on the time of year. And we'll supplement that sometimes with photography. So you got all those. And then there's a couple presentations. So if you have problems remembering where this recording is from today, this is going to be a very similar, actually, this is a very similar presentation on winter ID. There's a link here for a more summer leaf-based ID. And then this one's on specifically how to use a key that we have at OSU and where you can find that. It's a more of a leaf ID key. It's more of a teaching tool than it's a real detailed key. It's only got 88 trees in it. So there's some great resources for you. And then at the bottom one day, I just decided to go out and do video recordings of bark. And I don't remember, well, it looks like there's 23 bark IDs. So it just tells you the name of the tree. It shows you the bark up close and far away and gives you some bark scans. So there is a ton of resources for you there if you're interested in learning more about Tree ID. So with that, I'll take questions. We could show a video, but I think it's almost kind of silly because you can look at those whenever, and probably, I don't know how well it'll go across the internet. So it's really up to the group. So Jessica and Holly, whatever.
We'll definitely link the resources that he's given us. We'll put them on the website as well as on the Facebook page under the event profile, so you can go back and they'll be there.
And if you follow, it's SE Ohio Woods is the site, and Facebook. That's where I post those videos weekly, almost weekly. So when they pop up, they first go on Facebook, and then I park them on YouTube, and this is a directory to get to them. It's the website's probably the easiest way to find the old ones. But if you want to see the new ones as they pop, then you can follow that on Facebook. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Dave. This was
You're welcome.
fabulous.
Hopefully it didn't overwhelm people, because I know it's just like throwing it all at you. So hopefully at least something stuck.
And like we said, rewatching these presentations to absorb more as time goes on is great. And also as you go for a walk today with the warm weather, and you can practice some of the skills that you learned.
Yeah. And before you go out, I am going to get since we have a little time, I'm going to pull up the hazelnut one, and I'm not going to play the video, but I want to take you and show you the flowers that you're going to be looking for.
What if you could get rid of your kitchen?
And it's going to try to do an ad, and I'll shut it off as soon as I can.
My friend Lomi.
And then I'm going to just drag this, and it might take a while to catch up. But somewhere in about here.
So they have preformed male flowers that occur throughout the winter, and they're only about an inch in length throughout the winter.
And then they expand.
But as we approach the spring, we get into the latter part of February and into March, you're going to have those preformed male flowers, or catkins, expand. They'll get much longer. These are probably over 3 inches in length right now. They are kind of yellowish in color, and this is what produces the pollen. So this is the male flower. What many folks may not realize or have noticed is on the buds very close to these male flowers, you're going to have the female flowers. And it's very strange looking. You've actually got the vegetative, what looks like the vegetative bud with this explosion of red flowers at the tip. They're very bright red, they're scarlet in color, and that's the stigma and style of the flower. So those are the female parts, and they're pollinated by.
And those are out right now. So that's one thing to look for. That's kind of, you got to dig in there. If you see those real expanded male flowers that are usually 3-4 inches long, then go to those branch tips and start looking at the buds from the tip back and see if you can find some of those female flowers. It's just a really unique plant. And for years, I'd never noticed that. So it's just one of those things to be looking for right now. The video this week features willow. The willows are popping right now too, and they've got interesting looking flowers as well. So those are a couple things you can go look for. I don't think we're going to have pawpaw buds popped quite yet in flowers, but they might be starting to swell. So give you a challenge to go find that.
That's wonderful. Anybody have any questions? One last call. Wonderful. Well, thank you, David. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to perhaps seeing you at one of your Day in the Woods.
Absolutely.
Adventures,
Welcome to come down.
as well as seeing you out in the woods. So have a great rest of the day, everyone. And thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.